Hello, this is a video that kind of shows you how to use a database client. So there are a few concepts and there are a few little things that we have to do on the server. So the first thing I want to show you is this really kind of useful URL. Um, it allows you to use your browser, maybe even the Chromebook, to connect to the power server. So this way, you don't even need to install PuTTY or your own SSH client if you cannot get one installed because you might be using a company computer, laptop computer, and everything is locked down, so you cannot actually install anything. So the URL is https power.arc.edu and then /ssh/. Okay, so don't forget the last slash. So this is, once you get there, you'll see this, and then you just click connect the first time, and then you enter your student username, and then followed by the password. So if you have changed the password already, make sure that you use the changed password, and I do recommend everybody to change your password because otherwise it's just your 7-digit student ID, which is not a secret to a lot of people. So I strongly recommend people to change the password, and the way you change your password is to run a command called password, PASSWD. Okay, the OR is missing from the command. Once you press the enter key, it will ask you for the existing password. If you enter the existing password correctly, then it will ask you to enter the new password twice. So that way, you would change your password. If your new password does not match, if the two times that you enter the new password, if they do not match, then the new password will not take into effect for obvious reasons. So there is that. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be the concept of a database. So I just released a new quote-unquote lab. Okay, it is really just it's in the format of a quiz, but it has a lot of steps and a lot of discussions and a lot of concepts involved in it. So in by itself, it is actually kind of like a module, except it is a little bit interactive. You actually get to do stuff. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to demonstrate a few things where the concept itself is important. So there are two clients that we are talking about. There are two quote-unquote servers that we are also talking about. The first one is SSH. SSH allows you to get to a particular server computer so that you can use the command line interface. So that's kind of what SSH is mostly useful for, but it's not the only thing that you can use SSH for. Okay, but what we use SSH is to be able to access the command line interface on a particular server so that we can issue command on the shell, which is what we are seeing here. So when you see this prompt, okay, when you see your username, add power, colon, and then the utility sign or whatever path you're on, and then followed by a $sign at the end, that means you're in the SSH client, which means now you can issue commands on the server. Now, the second thing is a database. So the database is actually running on the Power server as its own server. So this is a server running, it's not on top of the SSH server. The SSH server simply provides a means in order to access the database server. So usually we do not need to manually access the database server because your web script is going to be able to do it by itself. But it is important to understand how to access the database server through the command line interface. So this way, when we need to create a table or when we need to inspect something, we have a way to do it instead of having your web script to explore the database. So to get to the MariaDB database client, we use the command called MySQL. That sounds really funny because why is it not MariaDB and instead is MySQL? It is a historical reason. If you're curious, you can always look it up. So you can always look up and compare MySQL versus MariaDB. So MariaDB is basically the same thing as MySQL. The only difference is one is community developed and the other one belongs to Oracle. So that's kind of the reason why there are two databases. Basically, they are the same thing, except one is a community developed and the other one is owned by Oracle. So apparently, a lot of people do not like things to be maintained by Oracle, and they decided to spin off this project called MariaDB. But for the most part, documentation for either one would work for this class. All right, so getting back here. So if you just type MySQL, um, it let me in already because I forgot to change one thing. Because normally it won't let me in. Let me let me get to the side because I have to undo all the things that I have done that to try out all the different steps. So let me undo that step first, and then we'll be able to see what it's gonna do. So I'm going to undo this part by um, and I'll get back to it later on too. Okay, so I have just undone something that I did earlier. So now when I run the MySQL client or MariaDB client by itself, you're gonna see exactly the same thing, which is it's gonna give you an error. Okay, it says your access denied for user whatever your name is at localhost, and it's because it is requiring to use a password. Now the password to the MariaDB client or server is the same as your 7-digit student ID without the W. And this one, you cannot change easily. If you want to change it, I can help you change it, but you just cannot change it very easily because the command to do it can only be run by the administrator. So you cannot change your own password for the database server. So the way you want to enter your password is to specify a -p. Now the -p part is called an option, but it's also called a switch. So in the more traditional term, used in Linux and Unix, it is called a switch. So you have to supply the lowercase p as a switch in order to have the MariaDB client program to interactively have you to type in the password. So let me press the enter key, and now it's asking me to enter the password. It really should be on a separate line. I'm not really sure why it's on the same line, but now let me enter the password. So this time you have to enter the password, which is just your 7-digit student ID. Even if you change the password for the SSH, the command line interface, you have to use the original password over here because there are two different servers. Remember, one server allows you to sign in to use the command line interface. That's your Power Account password. This password, on the other hand, belongs to your account with MariaDB. So there are two different accounts here. All right, so now I'm in MariaDB, and inside MariaDB, I am not connected to any database yet. On the Power server, there's a whole variety of databases because we use it for many different purposes. You have your own quote unquote database that is allocated to you. So what you should do is to connect to your own database. So you have to use the word connect followed by your account name. So it is the same account name. I'm using your account name as the name as the database that is allocated to you, and that's why we're using the same account name. Now, if you try to connect to somebody else's database, it is not going to work. Okay, so the Design Hub has its own database, and if I say connect to Design Hub, it tells me that I have no access to it. On the other hand, if I try to connect to the database of my own account name, then everything's good. Okay, so now it has made the connection. Now that we have made the connection, we can execute the SQL commands. One command is to show tables. Okay, so show tables followed by a semicolon, and there's no table yet. So you would see the same thing when you try to do the same thing because because the database that I have allocated to you is empty to begin with. There are no tables in your database. All right, so I think it is probably helpful to understand what a table is, when we are talking about a database. So let me um, switch to my tablet. Okay, it's going to take me a little bit of time to switch to the folder on the tablet for this class. There we go. And I need to do one more thing. Just give me. All right, there we go. Hmm. There we go. All right. So let me switch to. Uh-oh. I think my Remarkable just crashed. All right, give me a second here to restart it. Yep, technology sometimes doesn't work when you expect it to work, but that's okay. And I think it's over here. Nope. I'm just searching for my command line to start um, the Remarkable client. All right, so as we are talking about this, this is a good time to kind of remind you guys, what a client is and what a server is. So what a server is a term to refer to something that awaits requests. So by itself, it doesn't really do much, but it will respond to requests from a client. So you can think about a server like a server as a restaurant. Okay, so unless there are clients, unless there are customers, a server typically doesn't have much to do. The client, on the other hand, is the one that is making the requests. So a client is the one that typically interacts with an end user. Not all the time, but most of the time it is interacting with an end user in order to make requests. A server, on the other hand, is the entity that is responding to the requests, perform whatever action that is requested, and then provide an optional response. All right, so the tablet is working now, and I'm just making sure that it fits into the screen that is being recorded. There we go. All right, so there are a few things that really kind of make sense to use a kind of like a whiteboard to explain. The first one is something that we talked about already, which is the SSH client versus the SSH server. So we're going to draw a picture here. I'm going to switch to a ballpoint pen here. So on one side, we have a PC. So when I use the term PC, it doesn't really just refer to a personal computer running Windows. It also includes a computer running Linux. It also includes a computer running OS X, OS 10, and it also includes a Chromebook. Okay, so those are all on a so-called PC. This is the computer that you are interacting with directly and physically. So there's a PC side, and then there's the power server on the other side. Most of the time, although not always, but I would say most of the time, like 95% or more of the time, the programs running on your computer in order to do something, remotely is the client. And then whatever entity is running on the power server in order to offer that service is a server. So we have already talked about, we have PuTTY, which is the name of the SSH client running on PCs. And for those of you who are running a Mac OS 10 or Linux, you have a native program called SSH, and you just have to run SSH on the command line in order to access the SSH client, which is running on the PC. On the power server, there's a server program called SSHD, and D for daemon, DAEMON. which is basically a program sitting in the background and it doesn't interact using the command line interface. What it does is it's waiting for connections from a client. So these two are basically clients. They would make a request to the SSHD server program, and assuming you authenticate correctly and stuff like that, then it will allow you to type a command on this side. It will run on the other side and then comes back. So the SSHD on the Power Server, which is the server of SSH, is actually interacting with the shell on the Power Server. So the shell in this case is called bash, BASH, which stands for born again shell. Okay, and except in this case, born is not spelled as BORN, it is BRONE, which is the name of a person who wrote that particular shell. So a shell in this case is basically just a command line interface. So I'm just going to classify this as the command line interface. So the SSHD, the server of SSH, one of its things is it can interact with the CLI, but that's not the only thing it can do. Okay, it can also be used for file transfer. All right, so how does the MySQL client versus the MySQL server fit into this picture? They are all on the Power Server side. So you're not going to run a MariaDB client on the PC side because that would be pretty risky. That would basically open up access to all the databases on the Power Server using the database interface, which is a lot of exposures, and we don't want that to happen. So on the Power Server, we have MariaDB as a database server. So we got MariaDB as a server, and as a server, it doesn't really provide by itself, doesn't provide a way to interact with it, except for making network connections to it. So now we have MariaDB client. It's the CLI client as a separate program. Okay, and this is the program that we call MySQL. So when you run MySQL on the command line using the CLI, that's what we are running. So the CLI, the command line interface, would start the MariaDB client program, which in return will interact with the database server. So this is one way to interact with the server, but once we get into the web scripting, your web script, which is written in JavaScript, would also interact directly with the MariaDB server. So we're going to do it by hand first, which is what we are doing today, and once we master how to do some of the commands by hand, and we feel comfortable with that, then we'll also learn how to do it using JavaScript to do the same thing. So this is just a picture, overall picture of what you need to do. Now, somebody is going to say, but Tech, what about this? Okay, let me switch to the browser screen here. So what about this? What about having a particular page on the Power Server that is also acting as if it is just an SSH client? So let me show you what this looks like in the picture that we already have here. So in that particular case, we have on the PC running, we have the HTTP, bracket S client, which is a very fancy name for a web browser. Okay, so basically we have a web browser running on the PC, and in this case, it's using SSH as a protocol, but when you're using Firefox or Chrome or Safari or Edge, it's using a protocol that we know as HTTP or HTTPS, and hence the name HTTPS client. So what this is doing is it is interacting with Apache first. So Apache is the web server, which is responsible to handle all the incoming requests using HTTP, HTTPS. And then Apache is going to dispatch to a program called System in a Box. So I'm not going to type that out here because it's a long name, but it's called System in a Box, and that is the actual program that interacts using SSH. So this particular component here. Okay, this picture is not gonna look very nice, but I will try my best. So this particular component, which on one side interacts with Apache, on the other side, it actually makes a local connection to the SSH server, which is running on the power server, on the power physical. I shouldn't say that. On the power machine. Okay, it's a virtual machine, but nonetheless, it is a machine. So this is the box. This is system in a box. System in a box. I believe that's the name of the component that has to be installed in order for Apache to interact with this component, and then this box in return talks to the local SSH server. Well, I mean, when I say local, it's local to the power server. It is not local in the sense that it is on the PC. So this is a kind of general picture of what is going on between the PC side, okay, that's your machine, and the power side, which is a virtual machine that is running at ARC. All right, so once this picture is done, we're going to switch to a new picture. So now we're going to talk about what a table is, okay? And first of all, we'll talk about what the database is. So database, unfortunately, is a very common term. It refers to a few different things. But when we are within the context of MariaDB, a database has a very specific meaning. A database is basically a container so that a tables, queries, and other things within one database are completely independent from tables in another database. So it is a way for us to separate constructs from one database to another database. So every student in this class has his or her own database, and this is how we can avoid having one student to step on somebody else's database. I wish I could do the same thing about the port numbers. Unfortunately, that is not something that can easily be done by assigning specific port numbers, and people actually have to know which port number they have to use. So that's a separate thing. Okay, so within a database, the most important construct within a database are tables. And you can have any number of tables within a database. Your database starts with no tables whatsoever. So you have to create tables. And the module, not the module, but the lab activity would actually show you the commands to create a table, and it explains a few concepts along the way. So what a table is, okay, so you can have multiple tables, but what a table is basically you can look at it as a grid, as a table. So with a table, you have rows and columns. So the columns are corresponding to what we called fields. So in the example that we are going to do in the lab, one column is called the ID column, which is the identify column. One is called the display name, and one is called the description. Now that's really just a really simple table in this case. So within the table, each row, so these are the columns, right? So ID is a column, display name is a column, description is a column. And a column is also called a field. Now, if you want to look at it from the row perspective, each row is representing a record. It is representing, a particular item that we store into the database. There are some examples in the lab, so you can go through all of those in order to learn how to populate. Once you create a table, you will also learn how to populate the table using these individual rows. All right, so enough talking here. So what I'll do is I'm going to show you a few other things, but before I can show you those other things, actually I don't need to do anything else. I can use an empty table to show you the other commands. All right, so once you are done inside the MariaDB client, you can get out of it. There are several ways to get out of this particular client. You can type quit and then press the enter key. You can also just type Control D on your keyboard to get out of the MariaDB client. And Control D works in many different type of programs inside the CLI, the command line interface, and other tools to get out. That's because Control D is also known as the end of file in Unix and Linux. That it's not true for Windows machines, but when you're using PuTTY on a Windows machine to connect to the power server, then you're playing by the rules of Unix and Linux, not the rules of Windows anymore. So I'm going to type quit over here to get out back into the command prompt. So it is important for you to distinguish where you're in. In other words, are you in the client of MariaDB, in which case your prompt is going to look like this, or are you in the SSH client interacting with the system CLI where your prompt is going to look like this. So you kind of have to look at your prompt to kind of know where you are. All right, so we're going to create a folder. So one thing about the web client of SSH is it's a little bit slow. So we're going to create a folder called db.backup because the idea is how do I back up my database, and it's already created, unfortunately, because I went through this exercise before to make sure all the steps work the way they're supposed to. So now we can go to the backup folder, and I'm going to remove all the files. Now don't do this unless you know exactly what you're trying to do, okay? Because when you say rm and then the asterisk symbol, it is removing every file in that folder. Not exactly every file, but close enough, okay? So do this with care. So if you want to back up your database, your entire database, there's a simple command to do it. It's called Mysql Dump. It's dumping a database, and the way it's set up right now, you have to supply the -p in order for Mysql Dump to ask you to enter your password interactively, and then you can specify what database you want to back up. And your database has exactly the same name as your username. So whatever your username is, which is this part of the prompt, you can just put it over here. And then you press the enter key. And then you have to enter your password. Now you might be asking, but which password? Are we entering the password to sign in through SSH or PuTTY, or are we using the password to sign into the MariaDB client program? And it will be the latter, okay? This is the password that you are going to use with the database server, not the password that you use to sign into the power server to begin with. All right, so I'm going to put that in here, press the enter key, and this is the output. This is the database dump. So even though the database is empty at this point, it will still give me a dump, okay, which is just a text file. And obviously having the text file displayed is not going to help me because the folder is still empty. So I want to capture the output. So I'm going to rerun this, the same command, but this time I use a redirection. The greater than symbol is called a redirect operator or symbol. And what that means is whatever is displayed on the console, whatever is displayed in the command line interface, I want to capture all of that into a single file. So in this case, the way I do it is I usually use today's date, like that. And if you do this multiple times in a day, I would even include the time, and I would encourage people to learn how to use a 24-hour format, because this way you won't have the AM versus PM question. So it's 10:57 right now, and I usually give it an extension of MySQL so that I can just look at the file name and identify what it is. Now it is optional, okay? Whatever extension you want to use is entirely up to you. It still wants me to enter the password, and now it seems like it didn't do a single thing, but that's because all the output is now captured into the file that I call 2021-1006-1057.mysql. And now you can use Nano or any text editor, including Vim, to take a look at the content of this file. It's really just a whole bunch of comments and then some commands. And in this case, both dash dash is the beginning of a line of comment, and so is slash asterisk. So both of these are basically just the beginning of comment. And some of these comments are kind of special because they actually represent certain metadata related to the database, but nonetheless, from our perspective, they're not going to do anything in the database. Now, that is hardly surprising because we don't have a table. There's nothing to back up in the database at this point. All right, so let me get out of Nano now. Control X to get out of Nano. So let's just say that later on you did something and it messed up the database, or you want to retest your script using a known database configuration. So there are many reasons why you might want to restore your database to a particular point. So to do that, you basically reverse the process. You use MySQL, which is the MariaDB client, using -p, so that you can enter your password interactively, and then also your username, which is basically the same as your database name. So in this context here, as a part of the MySQL command, the mentioning of your quote-unquote account name is actually specifying the name of the database that you want to connect. So now all you have to do is to use a redirect symbol. This one is less than, not greater than, because it is redirecting the file back into the other side. So the direction is different. So this time I'm redirecting the file 2021-1006-1057.mysql. I'm redirecting the content from the file into the command into the MySQL client. So it would be as if I just typed everything by hand in order to restore the content of the database. So it would ask you for your password, and then it would appear that it didn't do a single thing, and that's because the entire content of this file is fed into the MariaDB client program as if I just hand typed everything. And by the time this file ends, then it will also automatically exit the MariaDB client program. So let me just restate what is important in this discussion. This is how you back up the current database, and this is how you restore from a backup of the database. All right, so both of these commands are fairly simple. They're pretty useful. So now somebody is going to ask, okay, but I want to do this, but without having to enter the password. How do I do without entering the password? So the way to do that without entering the password is to have a very special file in your home folder. So we are not in the home folder right now. We are inside a subfolder of the home folder, because you can see the tilde symbol here is representing the home folder, and we are inside a subfolder called db.backup that is under the home folder. Now there are several ways to create a file in the home folder or edit a file in the home folder without having to change your current working directory. So you can basically specify the entire path. So let me use nano in this case. Then you have to specify the entire path, which includes the home folder specification, and then the slash, and then .my.cnf. It's basically my configuration, and this is specific to the MySQL client. This is a very special name for for that particular program. It will look for this file in order to find out what configuration you have stored. So when you get into this file, it's empty because it should not exist yet in your account. So what you do is you type your square bracket, and then you mention client, if I remember correctly. I'll double check. So you mention client, and then you mention password, and say equals to, and then put it in a string. So I would put double quote and then whatever the password is. So I'm gonna hide this as I enter the password. So basically, whatever password you have, you put it inside the double quotes, and then you save the file. And say yes, and press the enter key. So now the file is saved. I am going to do some secret stuff on the side so that you cannot see my actual password, but I have it already entered in the file. I just have to copy the file back to where it's supposed to go. All right, so give me a second here. There we go. All right. So the other thing you also want to do, let me just show you, the file. Okay, so I'm gonna make a mistake first. So usually if you do a ls, okay, if you just use ls and then press the enter key, it should show. Oh, it'll be in the wrong folder. So let me go back to the home folder first and then do ls. And you can see that .my.cnf does not show up here. That's because every file name that starts with a dot or the period punctuation is considered quote unquote hidden. Okay, it's a very silly thing because it really is not hidden. It's just that in a normal ls it doesn't show up. On the other hand, if you say ls dash lowercase a, then it does show up along with a bunch of other files that starts with a dot. Okay, so we are not really concerned about the other ones. We just want to see my config is here. So my conf is here. And at this point, we should be able to get into the client, the MariaDB client, and also to use Mysql Dump without being asked the password. So now I can say MySQL, and I still, it's optional, but I still want to specify the database name right on the command line here so that I don't have to type that connect, command later on. Press the enter key, and you can see I went straight into the MariaDB client without needing to type a password because the password is already contained in the file that is called .my.cnf. So let me exit the MariaDB client first. Control D or quit. Last time I used Control D, this time I'm going to use quit. Press the enter key. Now we are back to the command line interface. So you will probably think that file is probably something that I want to keep as a secret from the other users, and you will be 100% correct about that. And the way to protect that file so that nobody else can see it is to use this command, chmod u equals rw, and then the name of the file, which is .my.cnf. Now, if you're in some other folder, or if you want to make sure that this command works with regardless of which folder you're in, you can always specify the full path. So this way, it doesn't matter what your current working directory is, because you are specifying a full path in order to change its mod. Okay, it's actually mode MODE, but the E is missing, so it's mod. And this command is also called chmod. It's change mode. Okay, that's the full name, but it's usually just called chmod as a command. So when you press the enter key, and now we have a little bit more protection against other people being able to see your password. And in a production environment, there are other things that you probably should do in order to protect any file that contains password and other sensitive data. If you want to learn how to use the command line, options and the commands that I have mentioned here, taking CISC 323 and CISC 24 is highly recommended. Because a lot of servers out there, they use Linux, and there are several reasons why that is the case. One reason is it is license free. There's no need to purchase a license to run Linux. And the second thing is it is actually a fairly lean operating system, which means you can use a fairly modest virtual machine in order to maintain the server. So it's really a good choice out there for most people. All right, so almost done here. The last step I want to show is not something that you need to do, but it is a cool thing to do. Especially if you're using Mac OS X or Linux as your desktop operating system, it is something that you can do, and I think it's kind of cool. All right, so this is my actual terminal it's this is typically where I execute commands, on the local machine. So when I try to sign in to my Power account, it would ask me for the password, right? And it would ask me for the password every single time, which also means I can't really use a script to do certain things because it still needs somebody to enter the password interactively. So there's a way to get around this problem, and it's using a public key file. So what you want to do is, if you're using Windows, you can stop right here, because this part only works if you're using Linux or Mac OS 10. So what you want to do is to do a ls and then a tilde.ssh. This is executed on the local computer. If you see the existence of this particular file, it means a key pair is already generated, so that you can use a key pair authentication method to get into the Power Server without being asked your password, which is really nice. Now, if this is missing, if id underscore rsa, which is this file, and id underscore rsa.pub are both missing, then you're going to have to run this command called ssh keygen in order to generate a key pair. I'm not going to run it because I got one already and I don't want to erase my existing key pair. So I'm not going to run it. But if you do not see id underscore rsa and id underscore rsa.pub, then you have to run this command. Once you run this command, once you confirm that you have id rsa.pub, then you execute the following command. This is really kind of interesting. It's not a very simple command, but I'll explain it. So you basically say cat and then tilde.ssh slash id underscore rsa.pub. So I am just using cat, which is a program to display the content of a file. I'm using it to display the content of id underscore rsa.pub, which is the public key file. And then I use a vertical bar, which is called a pipe symbol. It takes the output of one program and then feed it into the input of the next program. It is similar in some way to the redirection concept, but it's not. The redirection is only redirecting to or redirecting from a file. This one, on the other hand, is taking the output of one program and feed it to not a file, but the input of another program. So it's a very interesting feature. You can do this sort of thing in Windows too, especially in PowerShell. But typically, very few people learn how to use the command line interface in Windows. And then you type SSH, and then you try to specify everything as usual. Okay, I'm trying to sign into this particular account at the Power Server. And what is now different is we use double quotes to quote the command that I want to run on the Power Server. In other words, SSH as a command line program not only allow you to sign into a remote server so that you can interactively enter your command, but you can actually supply the command to run as a part of SSH itself. And this is a really, really useful feature for scripting things so that you don't have to do things on your own. So what I want to run remotely is the command called cat dash and then pipe to actually I take it back. It's cat dash or just cat greater than, which is it's almost like redirection, except this one is redirecting and appending. In other words, it doesn't erase the original file. If it does exist, it will simply make it longer. And I forgot one step. Okay, you have to make sure that the folder .ssh exists first. So you have to use make directory and create the .ssh folder on your right under the home directory on the Power Server. So you have to do this first, and then a semicolon separate commands so that you can enter multiple commands on the same line. And then the next one is cat greater than. Basically, it will take whatever content that you're catting out of this particular local file on your PC, and it will cat it into and appending a special file in the .ssh folder called authorized keys. So I'm going to spell authorized authorized keys. And that has to be a very exact, it has to be this name. And then you press, and then you enter the end double quote. So this is the command, these are the two commands that I want to run remotely after SSH makes a connection. And the first one is just creating a subfolder if it doesn't exist called .ssh under the home directory. And then the second command is going to take whatever I have in this particular file and append it to the file called the authorized keys in the folder of SSH. And of course, I forgot about that too. So I'm going to have to say, tilde slash .ssh slash authorized keys. Because without that, it would try to create authorized keys directly in the home directory instead of the .ssh subfolder of the home directory. All right, so let's check out whether this works or not. It's going to ask me for the password because it has the key pair has not been set up yet. But hopefully this is going to be the last time I actually have to enter my password. So here's my password, press the enter key. It doesn't show anything because everything is done by redirection. So now let me try to sign in again. And this time I want to sign in just to interactively interact with the shell. And it's still asking me for the password. So that did not work. Okay. Let me diagnose the problem. Authorized. Oh, okay. Typo. All right, so let me do that one more time. I had a typo because when I ran this thing, I misspelled authorized. Okay, I said authorized, which is not the same thing, right? So we're gonna have to use authorized keys. Okay, now this time it looks right. Press the enter key and enter the password again. All right, so it says you cannot create. That's okay. Makedir can fail because .ssh is already there, so I cannot create another folder of the same name. That's fine. It's not a problem. Now I'm gonna get out and go back in again. All right. Oh, okay. I double tapped the key. Let me close this one again. I'm going to clear the screen. So this time I'm on my local machine. How do I know I'm on my local machine? Because instead of saying, the username is different to begin with, but the host name is no longer power. It's called Yoga Tech. That is not because I practice yoga. I do not do yoga at all. I probably should start. But it has to do with my laptop computer is a yoga. It's a Lenovo Yoga X380. So that's why, I call it Yoga Tech. So anyway, so now let me try to sign in again onto the Power Server. There we go. And you can see this time it did not ask me for the password because the key pair method of authentication is already set up. So from here on, I can do some really, really cool stuff. Let me show you what I mean by that. So at this point, okay, I probably want to get to another folder to show you this. So you can go to whatever folder you have on your local machine. So the idea is backing up your database and putting that file onto the same machine where the database is residing. It's convenient. It's an online way, because if you ever need to restore the content of the database, it's already right there. Okay. However, it's not particularly helpful when you want to protect against a server crash, because in case of a server crash, you're going to lose access to the database, which is MariaDB in this case, and also your backup file at the same time. So it's not going to help you. Or in the case of a ransomware attack, it's also not going to protect you because whoever can access your actual database is going to be able to access your backup file as well. So, you're going to get the ransomware person to encrypt both and ask you for ransom. So it's not going to be helpful. So whatever backup you want to do, you might want to do an off-site backup. In other words, it's on a different machine and you want to make sure that the access cannot go in the opposite direction. Okay, let me explain what I mean by that. If somebody can hack into your Power account, okay, and encrypt and steal all your data on the Power server, if you allow a way to go from the Power server back onto your PC, then that person can go back to your PC and also encrypt your copies of backup on your PC. So it's not going to help. So you want the origin to store the backup to be on the machine so that it's a one-way direction. So you can only sign in from your PC to the Power server, but not the other way around. So this way, even if the Power server is compromised and got a ransomware attack, everything is encrypted, the backup file that is sitting on your PC is safe. Okay, so that's what we want to accomplish here. So now we can do it all on one single command. I'm going to show you this. It's really, really cool. So the way we do it is to start with the SSH command and specify my account name and also on which server. And then I'm going to create, I will specify what command to run on the Power server. So the command I'm going to run on the Power server is Mysql Dump. I don't need -p anymore. Remember, we set up .my.cnf so that I don't need to enter my password interactively anymore. So I just have to say Mysql Dump and then specify the name of the database, which is the same as my account name on the Power server, which is INT in my case. Now, I don't want to do a redirection on the remote server because that's just going to create a file on the Power server. So I'm just going to say that is the command. On the local machine, okay, so now I'm redirecting from the SSH command itself that is running on my PC, and I'm redirecting its output, which is basically the output of the Mysql dump command. So I'm redirecting that to my file that I'm creating on my local machine. So I'm going to use the same standard, 2021 1006 dash. The time has changed, so the current time is 1120.mysql. So now with one single command like this, press the enter key, and I have the file created locally. Let me just make sure that it's the case. I'm using nano and looking at this file, and this is the file. Now this is a very I wouldn't say very advanced way of doing things, but it's a very useful way of doing things because now on my local machine I can create a cron job. Okay, a cron job is basically just a job or a task that you can run periodically. Now Windows has a mechanism to do that too. I just don't know how to do it. Okay, you can always look it up. Cron CRON in Windows. I mean, that will probably get you the articles or instructions of doing the same thing. But on a Linux machine, it's called a cron tab. So if I say cron tab -e, which is basically to edit my cron job table, now I can enter this command and enter a time interval to do it. So now I can say, okay, every day I want to run this command, at a certain time. So I can create my own daily backup this way. Now, obviously, if that is what you want to do, you probably want to change this part here because this is a very static way, using today's date and the current time. And there are ways to create a file name or to specify a file name based on the current time and the current date. Those are slightly more advanced, topics. I'm not going to get into it here. I'm only suggesting the possibility because some of you might need to do this when you are working as a web app developer, because you might be running your own consulting firm. You might be doing this on yourself on your own, or you might be a project lead. You might be responsible to be also be backing up the data from the other side. So this might come in handy for some of you. For the majority, probably not so. Okay, but if you're still listening to me yakking at this point, I just want to make sure that you understand this is advanced stuff and you're not going to be tested to know how to do this. Okay, I'm just giving you some tips of some certain things that you might find useful when you become a developer. That's all. Alrighty, so I'm gonna end this particular demonstration now. And if you do have any questions about the database, I'm gonna start a new text channel on the Discord server, so that way just direct all the questions related to the database to that particular text channel. All right, so until next time.